In the Psalms layer-by-layer project, we have three big stages. First, the analysis, then synthesis, and this is followed by the application. The analysis has many component layers, and in semantics, we look at meanings, the meanings of words and phrases, of sentences, and of the psalm as a whole. When we come to Psalm 6, we read about God's anger, discipline, troubled bones, a prayer for healing, and a plea for God to turn around. We read about death and Sheol, weeping through the night, beds that float and melt, and an eye that wastes away. And then, near the end of the psalm, we read about opponents and evildoers who, after a jarring shift in mood, are told to leave because the Lord has heard. What's going on here in Psalm 6? How do all of these elements fit together? Through the centuries, there have been a number of explanations. Gregory of Nyssa, typical of early Christian interpreters, reads Psalm 6 with more than one layer of meaning. In the literal sense, David has composed a psalm of penitence. Allegorically, the psalm refers to the return of the Messiah to judge the world and restore all things. Rabbinic exegesis connects Psalm 6 with the covenant of circumcision on the 8th day, and in one view, David sang it when he got out of the bathtub. Ibn Ezra thought David wrote the psalm when he was sick, though it could also be read as a prophecy about Israel in exile. Now, most interpreters in the last 2 centuries agree that Psalm 6 presupposes a situation of sickness, even if, according to some, the author isn't David. The enemies mentioned in the psalm are explained variously as bad friends, like those of Job, or rebels who plot against the king on his sickbed, sorcerers who cause some kind of illness with their magic, demons that cause sickness, or a metaphor for the sickness itself. And some scholars don't even see sickness here at all. The primary problem, they would say, isn't sickness, but enemies, and the sickness is just a metaphor. What all these interpretations have in common is the assumption that Psalm 6 is coherent. What does it mean for a text to be coherent? To quote Dooley and Levinson, a text is said to be coherent if, for a certain hearer on a certain hearing or reading, he or she is able to fit its different elements into a single overall mental representation. A mental representation is a reflection of how content comes together and is stored in the mind. The various interpretations of Psalm 6 are each attempting to construct a viable mental representation, an attempt at building a conceptual framework in which all of the elements of the psalm fit together. The elements that go into a mental representation are not limited to what the text actually says. If this were the case, then we might expect more agreement among the interpreters of Psalm 6. The fact is, hearers may bring as much to their understanding of a discourse as they get from what the speaker actually says. Discourses force us to draw upon all we know about our culture, language, and world. For that reason, the further removed we are from the culture and language of a discourse, the more difficult it becomes to construct a mental representation of it. We might compare our challenge of constructing a mental representation of Psalm 6 to an attempt at working a jigsaw puzzle. This is a puzzle, mind you, with 2 problems. First, we don't have the top of the puzzle box to give us the completed picture. The other problem is that many of the pieces, which would have been readily accessible to the earliest hearers of the discourse, are now missing, and instead we each accidentally supply our own pieces that we bring to the table with us, pieces that don't belong to the puzzle. So we have to sift through the puzzle pieces in front of us, remove any imported from our own culture that don't belong, and supply those from the speaker's culture which may be missing. So what are we trying to do in this presentation today? We'd like to illustrate a method for putting the puzzle together, to demonstrate how we've gone about 1, analyzing the semantic content of the psalm, and 2, visualizing the results of our semantic analysis, so that it can be accessible to a non-academic audience. We'll walk through Psalm 6 step by step in an attempt to construct a viable mental representation of the psalm, piece by piece. Apologies for some of the tiny text here. The screen will soon be rather full, and it will become clear why the text is so small now. You might want to open Psalm 6 either on your phone or in a Bible to follow along if this is too small to see. The first verse, the superscription, gives us information about the genre, author, and liturgical use of this psalm. This is a song by David for the people, to be played on strings on the sheminit, the eighth, whatever that means. The most pertinent information for the sake of our analysis is that this is a psalm of David, i.e., that King David is presented as the author, and therefore the primary speaker of the psalm that follows. The assumption is that this psalm originated in some personal experience of David, and that this experience provides a situational context in which the psalm makes sense. In verse 2, the poem itself begins, and we are handed our first full pieces of the puzzle. David addresses the Lord and says, "Don't rebuke me in your anger. Don't discipline me in your wrath." Well, what does that mean? We can analyze the meaning of these opening clauses at three linguistic levels: the word meaning, the sentence meaning, and the utterance meaning. How, by the way, does utterance meaning differ from sentence meaning? Utterance meaning places the sentence into its larger social, historical, and discourse contexts. For our semantic analysis, we're concerned primarily with the first two levels, word and sentence meaning, though the line between meaning at the sentence level and the utterance level is blurry, and we're sure to cross it at some points. In our analysis of word meaning, we build on the foundation of the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, which we adopt axiomatically as our closest approximation to the biblical worldview. The Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew approaches word meaning from the perspective of cognitive linguistics. For each word in the lexicon, it gives a full definition for its various senses, and lists the semantic domains to which each sense of the word belongs. Let's look at just one of the words in Psalm 6, verse 2 as an illustration. The verb translated discipline, yisar apir, according to the Semantic Dictionary, is defined as an action by which humans or deities respond to negative behavior of other humans by administering some sort of punishment, which may range from a verbal rebuke to physical correction, often done with corrective intent, but sometimes also as retribution. The green label indicates that yisar belongs to the lexical domain, the cognitive category, of chastise, which consists of a group of words associated by general meaning. Chastise is itself a subdomain of events that describe connection, specifically association. The verb rebuke, hokiach, a hiphil from the root yod kaf chet, in the previous clause, also belongs to the lexical domain chastise. The blue labels inform us that yisar occurs in the contextual domains of authority, recompense, and behavior. These contextual domains are the contexts, that is, the scenes, the cognitive frames, in which the word occurs. Now, for our analysis, there are several important points. First, the definition of yisar explicitly indicates that usually the punishment is intended to be corrective, though it may sometimes be retributive. Second, this verb implies a relationship of authority and subordination between the agent and patient, respectively. Third, it also implies negative behavior as the cause for discipline, whether that behavior was insubordination or disobedience to the authority. This comes from the contextual domain of recompense. And fourth, although it is not listed here, This verb occurs frequently and perhaps prototypically in the context of parenthood. Thus, we suggest adding parenthood to the list of contextual domains. In order to enrich our own understanding and prevent misunderstanding, we found it useful to compare the meaning of Hebrew words as defined in the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew with the meaning of an appropriate English gloss, here, discipline. This helps us explicitly address some of our first language English assumptions about the relevant lexical and contextual domains, so that we don't accidentally import them onto the Hebrew word. The concise Oxford Dictionary defines discipline as to punish or rebuke formally for an offense. Thus, discipline and yisar are very similar on their basic meanings, but there are some important differences. The English word tends to be used to describe formal situations, while the Hebrew word, which can be used for formal situations, is mostly used to describe events in close interpersonal relationships, and specifically covenant relationships. Furthermore, yisar, in the Hebrew conception, while it is certainly not pleasant, is often a sign of favor rather than disfavor. The Lord disciplines them whom he loves, quote, as a father disciplines his son, end quote, Deuteronomy 8:5. So once we've analyzed the meaning of each word in a verse, we move on to the next level of analysis, sentence meaning. The meaning of a declarative sentence determines its truth conditions. In other words, to know the meaning of a sentence is to know what the world would have to be like for the sentence to be true. While neither of the sentences in verse 2 is declarative in form, and therefore they do not make any explicit truth claims, they do express propositions which could only be true under certain conditions. We refer to this as the propositional content of the sentence, that is, the kind of situation or event described by the underlying proposition. We can represent the propositional content of Psalm 6:2b as the Lord disciplines David in the Lord's wrath, which disambiguates all the ambiguities, that is, things like pronominal references, and casts the propositional content as a third-person declarative sentence. But this proposition comes in the form of a negative direction, so we cross it out here with an orange X. This is a situation that David wants not to happen. Once we've identified the propositional content, we ask, what would the world have to be like for this proposition to be true? What does this proposition presuppose about the world? What might it entail? What could be implied? In what kinds of situations would this make sense? In other words, what assumptions are bound up with this proposition? What missing puzzle pieces is the hearer or reader expected to supply? We distinguish three types or levels of assumptions, which we're calling or nicknaming the common ground, the local ground, and the playground. Common ground assumptions include information shared by the speaker and hearers. In our analysis, we mainly use this category to talk about the cultural background, that is, beliefs and practices that were widespread at the time and place in which the poem was composed. This is the background information necessary for understanding propositions that don't readily make sense to those who, like us, are so far removed from the culture in which the proposition was originally expressed. For example, in Psalm 6:2, why would the Lord discipline David? What would the world have to be like in order for something like this to make sense? In our lexical analysis of Yisar, we noted the connection between discipline and parenting. Also note that the speaker in this psalm is David, the king. Now, in Israel, as elsewhere in the ancient Near East, there was a common ground assumption that the king was said to be the son, quote-unquote, of God. This is a metaphor, whereby the father-son relationship is mapped onto the relationship between the Lord and the king. The Lord is the father, the king is his son. As the Lord's son, the king represents the Lord's rule and represents his characteristic justice, just as a son represents and resembles his father. The king inherits God's kingdom, as a firstborn son inherits his father's property. It's the Lord who guides the king with his Torah, as a father guides his son. And most significantly for our understanding of Psalm 6, the Lord disciplines the king when he sins, just as fathers discipline their sons. 2 Samuel 7:14-15 is instructive. The Lord says regarding the Davidic king, "I will be a father to him, and he will be my son. Whenever he commits iniquity, I will discipline him." So, some common ground assumptions for this proposition include David is the king is God's son, fathers discipline their sons when they disobey, and by syllogism, therefore, the Lord will discipline David if he disobeys. What we call the local ground assumptions are those propositions which are necessarily true if the text is true. These are either presupposed or entailed by a proposition. Entailments, if you don't know that word, are logically necessitated by the meaning of a proposition. For instance, "I killed the wasp" entails that the wasp died, because the definition of kill is to cause something to die. So in Psalm 6:2b, the proposition, "the Lord disciplines David in his anger," presupposes that the Lord is angry. Assuming the speaker's proposition is true, then we can infer this with certainty based on simple logic. What we've nicknamed playground assumptions are those inferences which might be true if the text is true. These are implications or inferences from the text. For example, knowing that Yasar usually implies negative behavior, and that fathers typically don't discipline their sons without good reason, the reader could infer that David may have sinned. This inference may be confirmed as we continue to read if, for example, David goes on to confess some sin. On the other hand, the inference could be cancelled or overridden if David goes on to assert his innocence. The nature of playground assumptions is that they may be challenged or negated as the text progresses, forcing us to revise our mental representation. At this point, we might also infer that if the Lord were to discipline David in anger, then David could die. Another playground assumption, and here we're clearly in the realm of utterance meaning, is that David wants the Lord to turn from his anger. So, now we have a handful of puzzle pieces scattered before us. That is, we have several propositions, both expressed and assumed, which we've identified. Our goal now is to structure this information so that it's comprehensible and useful. We've called one of our main tools for this task a story chart. If we define a story as a text with tension that gets resolved, then we can think of Psalm 6 in terms of a story, not a literary narrative, but a story in a cognitive sense. That is, Psalm 6 is a text with tension that builds and gets resolved. This story chart is the scaffolding on which we attempt to construct a mental representation of Psalm 6. The setting of the story is partly indicated by the superscription. This is a psalm of David. He's the king in a unique relationship to the Lord. God has said concerning the Davidic king, "I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him." So the story's tension begins to build when David sins, provoking the Lord's anger. God's now positioned to discipline David. Why? Well, because David is the king. The king is God's son, and fathers discipline their sons when they disobey. Moreover, if the Lord disciplines David in anger, then David might die. So now you may have noticed that this story chart has a big orange X through it, and this storyline is one that David rejects. His prayer is, in fact, aimed at preventing it from happening. We can also visualize the story that David wants to happen instead. He's sinned, and the Lord has become angry, but the Lord will turn from his anger, and David will be restored. So, moving on to verse 3, David prays for mercy, the positive counterpart of the negative plea in verse 2. Be gracious to me, he says. I'm languishing. He then makes a more specific request, indicating the concrete form that he wants that mercy to take. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are troubled. Thus we see that the Lord has already begun to discipline David, apparently in anger. The plea in verse 2, therefore, wasn't to prevent God from beginning the discipline, but to ask him not to continue to discipline David in anger. Because David requests healing, we might infer that the Lord's discipline has taken the form of sickness. There's a common ground assumption, right or wrong, that sickness is a form of divine punishment for sin. This is one of the core themes of the book of Job, for instance. Perhaps that's why David has become sick, and perhaps that's why he's weak and languishing and his bones are dismayed. The verb nibhal, according to the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, refers to the physiological response of trembling and pain that can come with fear or distress. Now, why would David be afraid? Well, if angry discipline or sickness could lead to death, and David is languishing, we might infer that David is near death. Perhaps this is why he's become so terrified that his bones tremble. In the next verse, we read that David's soul is dismayed. He asks the Lord, "How long?" Based on what we know so far, we might supply the rest of the sentence fragment. How long will you continue to discipline me in anger? Note, too, that we're beginning to chunk pieces together. David has sinned, the Lord has become angry, and the Lord disciplines David in anger, form a unit, our first scene in the story. The Lord disciplines David for his sin. And we've enclosed this first scene in a box. Verse 5 begins by pleading with the Lord to turn, shuvah in Hebrew. Many translations and commentaries take this to mean come back or return, implying that the Lord has abandoned David. But David's problem in Psalm 6 isn't that God has abandoned him. No, God is somehow a little too present, angry, and disciplining him. Turn here, therefore, means turn from your anger. Earlier, we inferred that what David wants is for the Lord to turn from his anger, and that assumption is confirmed here. Just like in verse 3, here also the petition for favor, turn from your anger, is accompanied by a petition for concrete action. Rescue me. Why should the Lord rescue David? Because of his loyalty. The common ground assumptions are that the Lord is in covenant with David and that the Lord's covenant loyalty will not depart from David's house, even if he sins. David seems to be implying, here another playground assumption, that the Lord has a covenant obligation to rescue him. As we're able, we continue to group propositions or events into boxed scenes to clean up our diagram. In verse 6, David makes another argument for why the Lord should rescue him. Because there's no remembrance of you in death. In Sheol, who will give you praise? And therefore, here's a local ground assumption, if David dies, he will not be able to praise the Lord. And we can infer, a playground assumption, that David is near death, on the brink of not being able to praise the Lord. That's why the Lord should turn, have compassion, and rescue him. In verse 7, David describes and expresses his grief and dismay, and he gives evidence of the fact that he is indeed about to die, which confirms our inference from the previous verse. He's become exhausted with groaning. He causes his bed to float every night. He dissolves his bed with his tears. These are striking metaphors. And it's as though he's already in watery Sheol, the place of darkness and the waters of chaos, where the Lord is not named. In verse 8, we find a surprise. A new participant comes onto the scene, apparently out of nowhere. David says that his health has wasted away due to vexation from his enemies. Who are these enemies? Do they fit into the mental representation we've been developing? Or are we forced to alter our representation radically to account for this new piece of information? Well, in verse 9, David commands these enemies to depart, to move away. If his enemies should depart or move away, this implies that the enemies have, in fact, already come close to David. Well, how can we best account for this? Recall the common ground assumption that sickness was a form of divine punishment. Thus, sickness could be a sign of sin and divine rejection. If the king became sick, some onlookers might interpret this to mean that the Lord had rejected him, and thus David's sickness presents a potential opportunity for his enemies, either foreign or domestic. That's why, when the Lord disciplines David for his sin, David's enemies approach. They've entered the scene to take advantage of the situation. This explanation also accounts for the reason David gives behind his command for them to depart. It's because the Lord has heard him. And verse 10 continues to echo this proclamation. This implies that, contrary to the enemy's expectations, the Lord has not rejected David. Instead, God is on David's side. Therefore, those who have opposed him are opposing the Lord himself. We can infer that this would be cause for dismay. The sovereign they'd been opposing has been vindicated by God. This would also be cause for great shame and public disgrace. And in the final verse, the shame and dismay which were implicit in verses 9 to 10 become explicit. Let all my enemies be shamed and deeply dismayed. Let them turn right around in sudden shame. As a result of this step-by-step process, we've arrived at a viable mental representation of the psalm. It takes the form of a story. As for the setting of this story, we can identify the two major participants and their relationship. King David is in a unique covenant relationship with the Lord. This covenant stipulates that when the king sins, the Lord will discipline him, but God's loyal love will never depart from the king. The story begins with the Lord disciplining David for some sin, with a sickness of some sort. Then David's enemies approach to take advantage of the situation. His state of suffering, brought about by God and exacerbated by his enemies, leads him to weep and groan in weakness and dismay. The turning point of the story is when the Lord hears, relents, and has compassion. Then, in the falling action, David's enemies depart in shame and dismay, and the Lord rescues and restores David. The problem driving the story forward is how long will the Lord be angry? The theme, the main point of the story, is, to use David's own words from Psalm 30, a moment in his anger, a lifetime in his favor. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. By the time David actually prays the text of Psalm 6, the Lord has already begun to discipline him. His enemies have already approached, and he's weeping and groaning in weakness and dismay. By the time he's finished praying, the Lord has heard and turned and had compassion. But David's enemies haven't yet departed. The Lord hasn't yet finished restoring David. This story chart doesn't represent the story as the psalm presents it. The process of building a mental representation happens line by line, but this product explicitly disregards the presentation order in the text of Psalm 6. This isn't the story of the psalm, but the story behind the psalm. It is the backstory that gives us a framework for making sense of the psalm, for putting the pieces of the puzzle together.